Hey everyone. Um, there was no short video today. A lot of you guys responded to me privately about the last video that I'd put up about your first test after you pass. Just trying to get you guys to start thinking, start understanding how this all works. Um, there's so much information out there, guys. I am a sponge, but there's only so much that I can show you guys. I just point you in the direction you guys should be researching your own. Um, But I've got Dave Zed tonight, who's a very close friend of mine, and our works really intertwine. Um, I'll let him explain though. So I wanted to come on. This isn't going to be a long episode. Just touching base with Dave. I got a lot of subscribers through him on this channel, and you guys should go over and subscribe to him as well too. So let me bring him on. Hey, Dave.
Hey, man, thank you so much for having me on. And let me just say that my audience absolutely loves you, and I appreciate your work. And I want to thank you for everything you're doing. I know you recently had a new book release, and so I just want to thank you for that. And to Micah's audience as well, Micah does phenomenal work. As Micah said, we're we're very, very close. And so when one of the main reasons, in my opinion, that then led to a personal friendship afterwards was that in Micah's work, mainly, if we think, for example, of sort of finding the needle in the haystack, whether this was a total coincidence, which I don't really attribute it to, or if it's something that Micah had more of a, you could say, a gift and ability to extract this information. He's able to sort of sort through separate the wheat from the shaft, so to speak, in terms of what's actually, you could say, legitimate and what's not. And one of the things that I really appreciate about Micah's work is that what he does is he really takes things back to the simple fundamental principles, which is something that in my line of work in the quantum physics area is identical, which is that there are so many of these advanced theories about how quantum mechanics may work, with respects to the, let's call the elephant in the room here, with respects to the people that don't really know the quote unquote secret sauce compared to the ones that do, that if we take all of these, super fancy sort of esoteric proposals, nothing against them, but we take those in quantum physics and we scale it back and we apply it to what Micah's work is doing. Micah's work is even more fundamental than that. And so one of the similarities I found, this is just one, by the way, is that Micah really tells everyone to go and reassess the basics. And that's something that I think is completely missing from every other area. And so that's just one thing that really, to tell you the truth, it really impressed me many, I think over a year ago now, since we started talking and having each other on each other's shows and all that. So that's just one angle of it. There's a few more, but
Yeah.
I can certainly keep going. But did you want to jump in? I don't mean to.
Yeah, no, not at all. I appreciate that. Because there's times you'll be doing like complex. I mean, your work is so complex, and we're both self-taught, and that's really the way you have to approach things. And unfortunately, the Bible PhDs and the physics PhDs both hate our guts because of what we've been able to do. But when you're not put in the paradigm, when you're not put in the box of this is what you have to learn every semester, this is what you need to write, this is how you graduate, this is how you have to think, when your mind can bring in these synchronicities to show how everything is related, that's a lot of things that done by people who are self-taught. And I always say the most interesting people are going to be self-taught. So what specifically have you been working on lately that you could share with us? Because we all know you've already explained the
anti-gravity stuff,
the anti-gravity thing,
right? Yes.
What has your world evolved into since then?
Sure. Well, one thing I can say is that I'm preparing on the back end for Micah and a handful of other individuals to be coming with me to prepare or to make several speeches to different groups that are both of private institutions and in some cases world government departments that are interested in trying to understand, because of obfuscation on their part or compartmentalization or denial of certain clearances. We're trying to bring more of that to literally to the light, so to speak. Now, that's the collaborative efforts that we're working on. On the personal side, I've been doing myself focusing on the human biofield, and basically I say consciousness, but I say that very carefully because it's a bit of a vague word or a vague term. What I've been focusing on lately are essentially, if we think of like a stack of books, say there's a stack of 10 books. If we are on book number 10, for example, if there are different existing books, both underneath, above, next to the book in which we are on in that particular regard. And so there's been, speculation about how potentially the not in a negative sort of AI type manner, but in a very organic manner, how the soul could be put into some type of, we could say, cryogenic stasis, for example. So that directly involves intent, which is consciousness, and then the human biofield as well. There are, for example, other things that I'm working on dealing with how potentially certain forms of, we could say, mass, which would come from a propulsion apparatus. Certain forms of mass could in fact be able to, when put next to, believe it or not, certain types of fruits, could in fact emit a sort of very natural electromagnetic radiation that is not a radiation in the sense of how we think may be harmful, but in fact may be beneficial. So things like this that I'm trying to really bring to the light in that particular regard. What's interesting about the biofield, though, is that it speaks to the way in which the cosmos operate, almost as if we are a piece of the cosmos that you have spoken on quite some time ago as well. So it's not like you've known about this for a while and you're in too, brother. So one of the connections, if I may, is that with the human biofield, there seems to be a sort of sense of behavior that could be modeled in certain ways, but this behavior is very cyclical. And this cyclical behavior has to do directly with the frequencies being emitted by the planetary orbits and the planets that are in orbit. And now, if I can connect it to your work.
Now you're literally starting to explain why a birth chart is important, because it's a snapshot of all the planets, all the asteroids, where everything is. And the other thing, too, is people think, well, Pluto is what takes 250 years to travel around the sun or something. We just had a Pluto return, actually, since the Declaration of Independence. How can something so far away get there? And then I have to casually remind people, and you could probably speak on this better in hand, that space and time is an illusion to begin with.
When one gets into the work of whether it's Micah's work or my work, it comes down to really how space and time is genuinely an illusion, and it is only as real as the individual perceiving and then believing for them to want it to be the case, which goes right to the dual slit experiment as well. But this concept, if I may say, about not just the planets orbiting, but the way in which what seem to be human behavior or moving in a particular circular manner, like we've seen a lot of the, I guess we could say, animals and cattle doing so in previous footage from social media and what have you. It's also reminiscent of what we see on a grand scale when we look at the cosmos and the way the galaxies work, but also with regards to how we are essentially the cosmos, or at least a piece of it, experiencing ourselves or experiencing itself relative to going on to that next book, if we stick with that example for a moment.
Well, we talk about how cutting edge quantum physics 25 years ago was string theory, but now, cutting edge quantum physics is that consciousness is fundamental, the universe is alive, and welcome to the party. They knew about this in the ancient times. Hermes talks about this 6,000 years ago. And yeah, no, absolutely. Everything is intertwined. I go into great detail in my first book explaining how we are all one, no matter what angle you look at it. And yeah, there are fundamental patterns. But you said something interesting a couple minutes ago, and I'm trying to understand the basically holding on the soul. or just just putting it in place? Are you talking about mathematically proving the shift from the human body into maybe another vessel?
I would go as far as to say that's been already proven even decades before I came around as well. It's come down to not just transferring the soul, but the question becomes, how long could it be preserved for? Now, again, when we talk about length, we're thinking of time. So, of course, that's still relative to the solar system in which we are allegedly within. So that's when it starts to get a little bit icky, so to speak, in terms of, okay, what are we relating this to? If there may be some type of alleged pole flip on its way, will that change the orbit of things, therefore change?
Oh, if the poles change, all astrotheology has to be recalibrated. Astrology completely has to be recalibrated completely. It's going to flip it on its head. And to be perfectly honest with you, I'm not smart enough to figure out exactly how everything shifts, but I know that everything, the way we calibrate things now, changes 100%. If it's a pole shift.
I can ask a question to you, Micah. Do you think that every time, let's just assume for a moment, there's some, like a clock, there's some type of shift or pole shift every, say, 12, 13,000 years. Let's just assume for a moment. Would you, regardless of how many X amount of years or whatever it is, would you assume that this is being, every time the zodiac, or when the zodiac wheel was given to what seemed to be humans, or whether it was something that our ancestors came up with shortly after this alleged prior flip, do you think that this sort of map, if you will, is handed to us or attained by us every cycle, and it must be because of the change of the orbits and all of this?
See, that's a good question, because I don't know, did I get you on Oppenheimer Ranch?
Yes.
Okay, so you know Diamond, he's a geologist, right?
His
work shows, I don't know if he ever spoke to you, but his work shows that we go through cyclical cataclysms every 12,000 years, 13,000 years. To understand the great year, which is the precession of the equinox, each sign is 2,160 years that we're in. And just to explain this to you, Dave, how you can easily know what sign you're in, it's not the easiest thing to do in the world, but on March 21st, which is the spring equinox, if you were to go down to the equator and you were to watch the sunrise that particular morning, the backdrop, there's a sign behind the sun. That's the sign that we're in. That's how you know we're in the sign. That is the best way to know what sign we're in. Wow. Now, because it's every 2,160 years, it doesn't just change like a clock. It's not like the 59th year and then the 2160. In the monthly astrology, you have 12 signs. You have 3 10-day in each sign. They're called decans. And there's 3 days at the beginning and at the end, which are called handover dates or cusps. That's when the energy transmutes. But over a longer period of time, not 30 days, but 2,160 years, the handover date is a little bit longer. So there is a blending of that kind of information. But my point to you was basically this. If we have a cataclysm every 12,000, 13,000 years, which it seems to do that, consciousness seems to rise, and then it sets us back down. We go underground, and then it rises. It's like a sine wave, basically, if you were to watch it that way. But what you need to know is that to fully grasp the astrological clock, you need an uninterrupted time of 2160 times 12 signs. That's 25,920 years. It's called the Great Year. You need that uninterrupted. So either they go underground and they still know this information, or it was handed to us. Because I don't think there's been a period of time that's been 26,000 years where there hasn't been a reset of some sort. This brings to mind the inner core that started spinning backwards. Have you read into that?
Yes, which is interesting because it speaks to this red-blue chirality of spinning and all that. But yes, I certainly have. And I want to say I agree with you very strongly, where I've also come across data myself and am of the humble understanding. And if there's data to suggest that I'm incorrect, I'd be more than happy to say I'm wrong. But so far, I've only seen nothing but consistency, including from yourself, which is that I don't think that there hasn't been a cataclysmic event in the last 26,000 years. I think there has been one, if not maybe more than one, in the last 26,000. So,
absolutely. You can see remnants and evidence of that too, because you're up in Canada, right?
Right.
There are animals, right,
Mhm.
that are native to the desert or
Yeah.
native to warm lands, and they're finding these skeletons all over Canada. Now, how the hell did they get up there? Unless there
Right.
was a shift.
You have even the in CNBC Indonesia. I can send you the article after this, which is that the
Mhm.
excuse me, the Homo floresians or flores. Forgive me if I butcher that, but basically what are were allegedly our ancestors, allegedly from about 50,000 years ago. I think
Right,
no more than 2 feet tall in height, but extremely strong, extremely fast. It's been stated by an archaeologist that they are still alive in Indonesia. And it's interesting because it was put out on CNBC Indonesia, but not the Western or European CNBC. So
right,
it's kind of like they're throwing it there, but it's just kind of being left there. But what's interesting is that there's footage that I've seen that it shows dirt bike riders just riding in Indonesia, and these same looking, at least in terms of physical description, beings are whether on purpose or accidentally, I don't know, but they'll tip the motorbike over,
right.
and then they will catch up to the motorbike. Once they keep riding again, they will outrun the motorbike, and then they will run into the trees or into the forest. So I mean, look, at the end of the day, if our ancestors, or whether they are or aren't, is not up to, not my point, but if they've had about 50,000 years for even some of them to have survived and keep that lineage of memory over what's happened, you'd have significant increase in intellect, and not just that, but even in physical capability. Now, that doesn't mean that they're necessarily ahead of us in a particular way, but they may
Right.
be in others. And this is where it starts to get interesting, because I think this whole thing of, are there species ahead of us or are there species behind us, whether they're related to us genetically or not, I think to me it speaks to more about opening up the concept of perception pertaining to what we may deem as advanced may be something that is significantly different than what has not been discovered by us.
100%. You know, it's interesting because I used to live in Boston, and my cousin, I'm not going to say her name because she abhors publicity, but my cousin is the top radiologist in the country, and she worked at Harvard. And when I was living in Boston, we went to a museum one day, and there were dinosaur. I don't think there were dinosaur bones there, but there was like it was an exhibit. There was like pieces of one of those Boston type museums, and we were having this conversation about creation versus evolution. And I was like, well, why can't it be both? Why literally can't it be both? Why can't there be a creator, but the way that it's set forth is with evolution? That's kind of the law that goes through, kind of like karma is the universal law. And then she jumped in and she said, you know, I've been studying this. When I was in college, we would study dinosaur bones. And the way that they're sectioned, the way that the human spine is, and the way that the dinosaurs, their thoracic, lumbar, and it's escaping me right now, but just the sections and the breakdowns, the bone numbers were usually all the same. So it's almost like there was a creation template that was given on this. So it would make sense that if you could go a period or find a safe space where you could ride out a global cataclysm, the last one being the flood. That's why every single society in modern, and I'm talking about the last 12,000 years, history has a flood story. More specifically in the Bibles, the Noah's Ark, which goes back to the Sumerian work. You can literally read it there too. In fact, there's a point in the Sumerian story where he lets a bird go and it comes back and it brings a branch, and they know that they can go on land now. So it's literally taken from there, but it's all the same thing. If there's a pole shift, it would be well. Walter Russell talks about how. Do you agree with the statement? Walter Russell. I don't know if you've ever read his work before. He's very
Yes,
esoteric,
the
right?
universal one.
He
Yes, yeah.
yes, he talks about how every single thing, everything is either electric or magnetic. Electric being the male, the radiant, and magnetic being the it brings it in, the feminine. What are your thoughts on that?
I would completely agree. And that doesn't, I'm not trying to say that's the end all be all statement, not at all. But as so far as to where I am in my journey of things, I would completely agree personally. Um, it, this idea, it's even how can I say it, it's even not just in the numbers, but in the way in which when one goes to the fundamental building block of life, it seems as though there's this parity of, again, I appreciate you bringing this up, actually, because I was going to bring up this idea of the manipulation, and I don't mean that in a bad way, but of what's called epsilon and mu, and that's just our modern way of saying those are variables that represent electric permittivity and magnetic permeability. So if we think of, for example, the magnetic permeability, sort of like the we could say acting as the body of water itself or the body of a fluid, then we think of the overall, like you said, the concept of the feminine with respects to allowing action to take place within that body. Then we think of, for example, okay, if that's the case with magnetism, could electricity then be the induction in which that event within that body is activated? Whether that is
Right.
with a human, male, female, whether that is with a body of water, whether that is with what they call empty space or the ether that is allegedly electromagnetic and radiative in terms of its composition, but operates like a fluid, just like
You know,
water.
it's interesting. Let me just jump in. Hold your
Sure.
thought, but let me just jump in real quick. It's interesting too because we talk about bodies of water, right, and magnetism. The moon is magnetic. Um, the moon is the feminine, and the moon controls the tides of the water, and we're what, 70 to 95% water. It's insane to think that the moon doesn't control us. I mean, Jesus Christ, the moon's waxing and waning 28-day cycle, 13 months, is exactly the same as a woman's.
I mean, this is when it takes us to the concept, if we think about it on a grander scale, of the this idea of the Saturn moon matrix, in terms of, okay, well, if the moon, to your point, represents that feminine permeability, where would the male permittivity be? And so I don't mean to immediately jump to Saturn without any data or anything like this, but you look at the hexagon on Saturn, you look at what seem to be the acoustic and radio wave emissions that Saturn gives off. I mean, it's interesting to see because particularly when you look at not just even Saturn, but the rings itself in which comprise Saturn, there's some very interesting correlations. And when we look at the planets, both the moon and Saturn, from a vector perspective, what we're seeing is an overlap of the vectors, which would substantiate what we now call, we could say, quantum overlap, so to speak, in quantum field theory. So it's interesting that there's that sort of resemblance. And
Right.
to your point and to your work, I think what we've been reading with respects to the ancient literature perhaps should be taken more literally than we initially thought, or more metaphorically, but then deduced to a literal interpretation.
Right. Like
Yeah.
what it metaphorically means. And it's interesting you bring up Saturn too. Saturn, the Jews' day of rest is the Saturn day or the Saturn day.
Right.
That's where they get it from.
Right.
They also wear a black cube on their head. You know what the black cube is? You know what the Muslims walk around the Kaaba, the black cube?
Yes.
That is because the hexagram, what is it? It's a storm channel. It's a storm system at the northern part of Saturn.
Yes.
The cube fits perfectly into it. That's why the Jews and the Muslims all wear the black cube. That's why you have the Nintendo GameCube that's black. That's why the Sega Saturn was black. That's why and they know this. What my work tries to do is every ancient holy text was written metaphorically, and people just argue that it's literal. I am trying to expose the history of it. And in my book series, what I try to do too is, I mean, people, you could say, you know, George Orwell or Philip K. Dick, they all write metaphorical stories. Why doesn't anyone just come out and say what everything is? And that's what my book series is basically about.
And can I add very quickly, there are people that also like to come in and, with bad faith intent, come in and stir the pot by making up interpretations and then just starting arguments amongst others. And then they kind of walk away kind of, getting all giddy and laughing.
Yeah.
Because they kind of go, oh, okay, mission accomplished. I stirred the pot. Now no progress will be made.
Right.
Before you go on, sorry to cut you off. it
Yeah.
made me think of, and I'm just extrapolating ideas off the top of my head here, but recently I've been studying something pertaining to this concept, for lack of a better description, of mini black holes being all around the human biofield, not the ether, but the human biofield. So
Right.
relative to our, what you'd call our aura or our pheromones, emissions from the
The
shock.
toroidal field,
The
if you want to
toroidal
use
field.
that
Thank you.
word.
There we go. So we see the black cube being something in which is praised quite avidly. Well, what's interesting about, whether known or not, what's interesting is that there's been a theory that we may be within a sort of black hole with respects to not just Earth, but the orbits of the planet. And if something were to be keeping us in a black hole so as to make us think, for a number of reasons, we're alone in the universe and all this kind of stuff, then the opposite of a black hole, as it pertains to loop quantum gravity and quantum field theory today, is a white hole. And a white hole is what is allegedly experienced when someone goes through, or information goes through the very center of the black hole, where everything is propagating from. And we see that from a data perspective because we see that Hochberg and Visser out of Los Alamos, I believe in the 80s, 80s or 90s, put out multiple papers where they proved that the throat of a wormhole and a black hole is all that's needed to be understood about that apparatus. Because then
Right.
once you know the throat, you can then build integrally, like steps of a stairs from there. I said this on a Zoom call with my members recently. You don't, if you're a bricklayer, or you do paving or anything, and you have to do some steps, you don't say, okay, let's start at step 7 and then I'll do step 5 and then I'll do step 10.
Right.
No, you start from 1 and then you build from there. So it's possible that we can even apply that to the cycle in which your work lays out very well, which is this idea that it starts with one person basically waking up in the age of Aquarius, if we relate it to modern times, and then it starts to build, it branches off like a tree to other humans and other people. And then that sort of idea of manifesting things continues in a spiral manner. And I'll end it with this. When we think of, for example, wanting to achieve a task, or we think of, I'll use yourself, Micah, as an example. When you started your great books many months ago, you didn't say to yourself, okay, I'm going to, I guess you could say, I'm gonna write this one book, and then you didn't expect the following day or even the following week to have the book finished. It literally took you time and effort. But one could argue that's a cyclical process, because if it was linear, the book would immediately sort of show up right away in the order in which we thought. No, you had to think, maybe you had to sleep on some topics, you had to discuss maybe with your wife, for example, and then you start to write a chapter. You see what I'm saying? So
yeah. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but explain to me if this has anything to do with it. Sure. I'm under the impression that inside, you mentioned inside a black hole.
Yeah.
I was under the impression that within a black hole, there are two forms of information. One is, let's say I'm in a black hole, and I'm in the black hole. So there's me in the black hole. But then on the surface level of the black hole, isn't the information also spread out equally?
But as I understand it, what happens is a sort of spherically symmetric, we could say, how can I put this? Spherically symmetric geometry and observation. So in other words, yes, it would depend on the relativity of the observer, where they will then say, okay, I am inside of for example, a half sphere of a white hole, compared to I'm outside of a black hole or entering a black hole. So there is this proposal that there's this sort of branching off of information within the white hole, like you said, sort of like how a tree grows from its trunk,
right,
and then it branches off. Absolutely. The question becomes, could that information be writable, manipulatable, or whatever? Because this information, once it is within this white hole, so to speak, allegedly moves at the speed of light. And that's how this potential one angle of non-locality may occur.
Mm-hmm. Now, what I find fascinating about your field, one of the things that I can't quite wrap my head around, but maybe you can, is they say that the past, affects the future, or it gives building to. But there's also some theoretical people out there that say that the present actually affects the past as well. Is there a mathematical way to explain that?
Oh, yeah, very much so. That man, that's a good question. The I would dare to say, in my humble opinion, that in my interpretation, the present is the most powerful in affecting both the future and the past, if that makes sense. Because
Uh-huh.
from there, you can then choose to take action on something. If, again, if we view it in the perspective we're discussing, then we could choose certain events in our future that we then will take that will change the relativity of past events. So let me give you an example. I can take this espresso cup, this coffee cup, and place it to the right of me, for example. But then if I choose to say, I don't know, head upstairs, then but leave the coffee cup here, I know eventually that I will have to come back and attain it. Whereas if I brought it up with me now, I have closed that loop, so to speak, of bringing it with me and then putting it where I feel it should, you put it into
Mhm.
the sink or something like this. And so the idea is essentially is that by changing the now, you are effectuating both the future and the past, depending on what you do now. Now, it starts to get a little bit trippy because then you start to think, well, technically now is always the past. Well, that's one way to look at it. The other
Right.
half way to look at it is, well, the future is now as well. And there is no right or wrong way of viewing it. It's just, can we perhaps find a synergetic merging point where, dare I say, the future and past don't even exist? And that goes to the collapsing of the wave. And of course, your work as well, where it speaks to that dot in the center of that spiral, the center point of the zodiac wheel, in which
Mhm.
right at the 0 point of that radius of that zodiac wheel,
Mhm.
it is the very center point is indifferent to every other
Right.
season.
You know how we say, for example, this bottle, right?
Yeah,
If I put it behind me and no one can see it,
right.
uh, and I'm using this bottle as an example for like a molecule or something, all right,
Sure,
for an
sure.
atom. Okay, if it's behind me and nothing is observing it, nothing is collapsing the wave function, then it exists in superposition, right? It exists as a wave of probabilities, and then when you see it, it collapses it.
It essentially, as I understand it, to a particular degree, the it also depends on which individual is observing it, in the sense of, it depends on their emotional state, it depends on their mental state. And this idea of superpositioning goes right back to an infinite amount of, say, stacked books, and those books in this case represent the outcome of what you're going to experience when you turn around in this example. And so what then ends up happening is, depending on your emotional state, this is actually something done in um, neurology and psychology and brain science by Dr. Carl Friston. It's called active inference. This idea that there's an infinite amount of possibilities or books that are underlying the top book of what we're experiencing, but the observer slash experiencer's mental state, emotional state, spiritual state will dictate the probability of what is experienced once they turn around, if that makes sense. So you may have, say, you have a door behind
I
you.
guess you could kind of think of it as like, let's say we're both looking at something, right? We've
Right.
already made the UFO example where someone sees a
Yes. Yeah.
triangle, where someone sees. We've already done that.
Right. Right.
But I guess to basically bring it down even further, let's say me and you are hanging out and we're looking at a painting, and
Right.
I observe it in one way, but you're colorblind. You see it in a completely different way. It depends on the observer. So that's like a nice way to think about it.
Not just that, but even optically as well, is sometimes people will have a quick moment where they'll think that a painting or a picture they're looking at has suddenly moved very
Yeah.
quickly, right? That, in terms of one's perspective, that is not necessarily an incorrect fact or
Right.
statement to make from a quantum perspective.
So there's this whole theory, there's this whole thought theory that if all conscious life on this planet died, would the planet still exist? Would anything exist if there was no conscious observation? And then you think about the fact that if they're saying that the universe is conscious now, then doesn't, if the universe is self-conscious or conscious, then doesn't everything have to exist? Because nothing would be outside of it to not be observed.
These man, this is I man, these are great questions. This is a so I would say, as long as there is and I'm really trying to simplify because I'm gonna have to go into like a 3-hour word salad, and unintentionally if I did, but basically I would say, to your point, that if there was some form of uh, existence outside of individual perception, it would only speak to a fractalized or tethered connective part of ourselves in which we have yet to experience. And I'm not saying that there isn't nothing, but it would speak to this idea of something from nothing. For there to be nothing, there has to be something, and
Mhm.
vice versa, if that makes
Correct.
sense. So
Everyone's
if we are
polarity. One implies the other.
right, and
Um,
if we were a piece of the universe, which I'm of the opinion that we are,
we are
um,
100. We are 100%.
right, right. And I would say that ultimately, if we are not at a point of realization with respect to a spiritual, we could say, level of us moving to another, say book 10, we don't know, we think there's only book 1 to 10 when really there's book 10 to infinity, then
Correct.
I think that's when things start to get interesting with respects to personal experience and journey, because
Right.
each individual's journey is separate, but everyone ends up at the same point. But that's just like saying, for example, I want to order a pizza, 12 slices and a nice pizza, but you tell the people you're ordering the pizza from, I only want to eat slice number 12 over and over again. No, there's what there, you got to eat slice 1 to 12. It doesn't
Right.
work like, yeah. So
Right.
that's where I'd put it. Yeah.
Cool. I mean, the interesting thing too is that when you're talking about parameters. You're talking about we're all experiencing it, but the parameters you're talking about, that's basically our audio parameters and our visual parameters, because it's interesting. Because in part of my work, what I talk about is I talk about people that have near-death experiences. Their hearts stop, and then they leave their body.
Yep.
They don't have physical optic nerves. They don't have timpani in their ears. They don't have any of this kind of stuff. And yet, as a spirit floating away, they say they can see better than they can hear. They can hear better than they can. In fact, in higher realms, Dave, talking is completely irrelevant. Did you ever see Men in Black?
Yes. Yep.
Do you remember that scene with that little ball that would like repeat what they're saying ahead of time, and then Will
Yep.
Smith knocked it all over the place?
Yeah.
And he said that
Yes.
human language is actually slow. It is,
Yeah.
because in higher dimensions, you communicate via telepathy.
Which also speaks to time operating differently there as well, because
Correct.
then
It's
it takes
fluid.
us right, exactly, it takes us time for us to explain this by definition. Without the extension of that literal, what we call time, there would be no way for us to even be talking right now. So to your point, exactly, I couldn't agree more. I think, as a matter of fact, there'd be far more of this. I mean, again, I'm speaking from a kumbaya type, let's all sit by the fire type world. But if everyone was immediately, say, psychokinetic, where the thoughts were instant and there was no need to take as much time as we do now to debate, to express things, I mean, of course, there'd be far more progress, in my opinion.
What is faster, the speed of light or a neural connection?
Ooh. If we're taking the neural connectivity part to that of a modality that would then translate into a sort of contour within the mind, and then go into the non-physical, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
Probably, if we're speaking in that context, I would say the mind and the brain.
I would
Um,
agree.
I
I would
would say,
agree.
yeah,
And as
yeah,
far as time being fluid, I explain this too. I talk about time being fluid. When you reach higher dimensions, um, it's fluid. It's malleable. It doesn't theoretically exist, but it's malleable. This is why I tell people that if you decide to come back to Earth, your next life is not going to be in the future, or it doesn't have to be. Your
right.
next life could be a peasant from 500 years ago, because time is fluid and it doesn't work that way.
Actually, can I give an example? And then, if you don't mind, if we wrap it up in the next few minutes,
Yes, absolutely.
I'm super tired, man. I'm so sorry, but
I'm sorry about I'm sorry about these softball questions.
oh yeah, so it's as you can tell, very easy for me to answer them. So if we think of a surfer on a body of water, we think of the body of water as being within our perception, flat, in the sense of there's no, I mean, unless there's a wave, there's no consistent curvature of the water. So say, for example, we have the surfer on the water at point A, and he's surfing towards point B on the water. Now, if the water itself as a fluid represents time, because it takes that time for the surfer to get to point B, the question becomes, in these other, say, levels, realms, dimensions, whatever, to add to your point, brother, the idea would be that just by thinking of where one wants to go, the surfer is then taking the body of water with point B, and then instead of it being flat, curving the body of water to the surfer.
Yeah.
And that water also
You're talking about a Mobius strip.
Absolutely. That would represent space-time metric as well. That's also representative of a traversable wormhole, where you bring the location to you, or essentially you meet it, sort of like a doorway.
It folds like one of those like one of those foldable laundry baskets that you could fold down.
Yes, precisely that. This speaks to superpositioning, in the sense that, think of that folding, but it's infinite, in terms of how many levels it can fold into or out of. Right?
Because the idea that you see in old sci-fi is basically you have like the Star Trek, where people they beam each other from place to place. That's not theoretically possible, because you'd have to transpose each individual molecule in the same exact place in order to reconstruct yourself at a location. What you're talking about is taking that whole procedure out, and then it just being an instantaneous thing. That's why they say Earth is created where it is. It's because it's between a lot of interdimensional portals that it's basically like an exit on a highway, that's basically what it is.
Which is why, as well, by the way, this speaks to this whole concept of, are we inside of some type of black hole or some type of wormhole or something like this, in which we have the illusion via astrological observation that we are moving, but we're not increasing in any particular direction, because there is no relativity to compare outside of our orbit to. The question becomes, if this is some type of interdimensional doorway or a sort of gas station pit stop, and these beings that are coming and going, whether physical or not, realize that, the question then becomes, is this sort of like the people running the gas station know that they're giving the illusion to the employees, for example, that the gas station itself is not actually filling up their cars with gas, but no one else knows that. You see, so that's how I would liken it to. But I'm so sorry, man. I do. No,
it's fine. This was great, man. Just let everyone know where they could find you, and you'll keep me posted, right? The second you hear anything from a place,
absolutely,
let's do this. Even if it's a virtual conference.
Absolutely. 100%. Well, I want to thank you so much to yourself and to your audience for bringing me on. This has been a beautiful conversation. I could be found at patreon.com/Generation Z, spelled ZED, no space, no caps on Generation or Z. Also at DaveZed.substack.com, as well as Generation Z, again, ZED, for all of them. Podcast, you can search that up on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Podbean, or YouTube. And of course, we do different types of consulting, of which Micah is a part of, with respects to our initiative for presenting to various groups. And if anyone's interested in that, you can email me at saltllc@protonmail.com. Salt spelled SAALT, LLC@protonmail.com. So thank you so very much.
Do you still think that Proton Mail is a completely encrypted secure network?
Not necessarily, but I know. Well, let's talk after we finish.
Dave, thank you, brother. I'm going to email you this right now, okay?
Thank you so much, man. Thank you.
Later.